Welcome to the Hollywood Reporter's Closer Look. I'm Rick Porter. I cover TV for the Hollywood Reporter. We're discussing TNT's Snowpiercer today with showrunner Graeme Manson and stars Jennifer Connelly and Daveed Diggs. Welcome, everyone. Excited to have you, and thank you for your time today. We're going to start things off with Graeme. When you came onto the show, you did a pretty thorough reworking of the original pilot. Can you discuss what you wanted to bring to the show and what your overall vision for the material was?
I absolutely loved Bong Joon-ho's movie, and it was the movie that then drove me to the graphic novel, so I was familiar with them from the start. The graphic novels were concerned with a different kind of apocalypse. And it was director Bong and his writing partner who brought the idea that climate change was the impetus for the disaster. And I thought that was really important. And, we felt that was going to be the thing that resonated really strongly when the show was airing. Little did we know that these themes of incarceration and immigration would not only would not be buried, but would be taken over by something like COVID or like the pressing political action of the Black Lives Matter movement right now. They all seem prescient to the film. They all seem germane to it or to the series, and I just think that's because the series is it has these iconic stories of human struggle and inequality, and I think any way you flip it, there's gonna be things occurring in the real world that are reflected in this kind of sci-fi.
Jennifer and Daveed, the show's depiction of class differences and the sort of somewhat authoritarian structure of Snowpiercer seem really strikingly relevant given our current moment. Can you discuss Melanie and Andre's different viewpoints on the system that's set up on Snowpiercer, and how are those themes resonating for you two right now?
The structures mimic our own, and all the structures are in place. So a lot of the reason that you get things being criminalized is because there's a need that isn't being met equally for everybody in an even sort of way, right? One of the things that Snowpiercer as a society is grappling with is the fact that people are going to have to give up things in order to make it more equal. And that's tricky. That is tricky for people to do. Particularly when you look at a class of people like those of us who are in the tail who didn't have tickets onto the train, right? So there is an argument to be made that y'all are not even supposed to be here. So how dare you get included in the participation of life that happens on it? Why should I have to give up anything in order to make things better for you?
Jennifer, what do you think about that?
Melanie didn't create the system, but she, as a person in charge, didn't decide to to take it apart either. In the service of her ultimate goal, which again was to, ensure the survival of the train and its inhabitants, she chose to sort of maintain the status quo and keep the system going. And at a certain point in the arc of the season, there's a reckoning. And I think that's when things get really interesting for her. Snowpiercer looks very different depending on which car you're in, and that applies to the living quarters, that applies to education, and that applies to justice. And I think that's a very relevant issue right now.
Graeme, the story within Snowpiercer is that the people in the tail are a strain on resources. Is there truth in that, or is it more of a convenient fiction to keep order on the train?
I think that the train does have the capacity to absorb the tail forward into the train. It has the resources. but the class structure does not allow that, and that's the trap that Melanie's in.
And the sort of short-sightedness of that comes with the fact that most of the work and most of the things that the tail is doing to keep the train moving is happening unseen, right? And so this is when you get into the interesting parallels with the immigration debates that we're having. The greater question that begs is really, what are you willing to give up that you didn't even realize that you had, you know? And those are the discussions you really need to start having with yourself. And I think it's the discussions that we start to see being had on the train as we sort of navigate first class and see the differences of opinion even within that class, right? So those are the things that I see playing out kind of more in the front of the show now than I think we knew they would be when we were shooting the show.
Jennifer, your character is all about maintaining control and order on Snowpiercer, or at least the appearance of that. When you have to show a poker face a lot of the time as a result of that, how do you convey what Melanie is thinking or what she's feeling at a given moment?
I think that the order is a byproduct of her primary concern, which is the survival of the train and its passengers. That's really what she's fighting for. The interesting thing is that methodology is challenged at a certain point in the show, and so the facade that you're talking about starts to crack when she is challenged, and that's part of what made her really interesting, was her inability to maintain that facade. You know, I mean, in the early episodes, I think that she's, you know, this train had been running for approximately 7 years, and so she was used to playing that part. And then I think this kind of opposition presents itself in the form of Leighton, and she really takes that on board and questions the methodology and her own actions and her own responsibility.
David, a similar question for you. When Andre's out of the tail, he has to keep a lot of things close to the vest about what he's observing and what he's picking up on how the train works. What sort of things, either through physicality or the way your eyes are moving, did you try and show that he's taking everything in?
I hope it comes across. I was hoping to make Leighton much more observant than I am. And so he is constantly catching things and picking up on things. The script was always pointing to this, little tidbits of information that he was collecting in order to bring information back to the tail, because it turns out the real currency on the train is information. And Leighton has always struck me as the kind of person whose skills were particularly useful to being a cop. He's always questioning systems. And so, you know, I think he has both been a cop and been Black long enough to understand the ways that those things are at odds sometimes. And I think once transferred to Snowpiercer, I think he is constantly trying to be pretty democratic with the way that he does things, but he's also just good at some things. And so eventually he ends up becoming like a pretty reluctant leader in a lot of ways. But I think the power element of it for him, the imbalance of power, is something he's always thinking about and trying to figure out how to distribute that to as many people as possible.
For Graeme, why was it important for you that Leighton figures out at the end of episode 4 that Wilford is not on the train? What does that help you do in terms of moving the story forward and continuing the tension between him and Melanie?
Well, I think that we always saw the initial detective story as a way into Leighton's larger revolutionary ambitions. So our idea always was to meet Leighton and establish that character and set him up against Melanie in this enforced cooperation, and to make sure that David always had that extra agenda to play with, that while solving the murder, he is learning how the train works, and he's going to apply that to how to help the tail, and ultimately how to resist and kick off their long-awaited revolution.
Jennifer, can you elaborate on the burden that Melanie feels in carrying the secret that Wilford is not on the train?
Running the show is not what she was trained to do. That's not her education. That wasn't her calling. That wasn't what she devoted herself to all of her life. She's an engineer. That's what she was first and foremost. And she made this decision. And once she made this decision, certain things were set in motion, no pun intended. And then she's caught up in it, and she has to make choices along the way. I think that she's someone, like all of the passengers on the train, she experienced an extreme trauma getting on the train. And she suffered a great loss. And I think that she compartmentalized that to such an extent. And I think that the choices that she is making to keep this train moving are further compartmentalizing her and kind of calcifying her. And then she starts to really experience what she's lost and what she's done and what that means for other people and the cost of it all. And I think she's able to feel that. She feels that burden more and more, I think, as she confronts these choices that she's made and impact that it's had on the people of Snowpiercer.
It sets the sort of big mystery question of the season, what happened to Wilford? But it also really helps to drive Jennifer's character, Melanie, because it's like, what did Melanie have to do with it? And how did she come to be sitting in the engineer's chair? And unpacking her reasons for doing this is really unpacking Melanie's character arc for the first season. She's got this terrible conundrum as Jennifer alluded to, and I think it's probably the most interesting, dilemma that I've worked on with any character, because the stakes are so high. It's literally the future of humanity, and these are the things that Melanie is balancing.
Graeme, what are the challenges of expanding this, what was a fairly self-contained movie, into at least 2 seasons of TV? Do you need to go off train more in the future, or can you keep pushing the narrative forward by remaining mostly within the confines of Snowpiercer itself?
No, I really find that, sort of the enforced structure of this show takes place on a train. I find that I think it's good to have those kind of rules when you're writing. It forces you to really address the world of the show and create something that is unique. The real positive for the whole Snowpiercer story in telling it in a serialized TV is that you can dive so deeply into character. Early in the process, we were talking about what is the bottom line for Jennifer? What's the backbone, the backstory? What happened just before she got on the train? Why did she decide to take this train? And it all came down to her daughter, and we talked very deeply about that. And that the character of her daughter became very big in season 1, and really, really drove Melanie's character. And we went about discovering these things for each of the characters. What is it that drives them, and what do they have in common? The thing that everybody on the train has in common is trauma. They all lost the world, and the world that they lost and all the people that they loved, that was our world, this world right now. So I think that that makes it, it gives it something really solid and tangible, and this sense of grief and loss for actors to latch onto. And I think that sort of underlies everything and really pushes the story in ways that aren't just plot and train related, but are it becomes about how we come to terms with these horrible things that we're faced with at this time. This inequality, privilege, incarceration, immigration, all of these things become important for the characters in light of where they all come from. You know, in light of the world they left behind. Why not create a better world? And I think that's certainly David's drive. And I think it's Melanie's drive as well. But Melanie's got a little bit caught in the realization that it is actually easier to accept authority and to maintain some order, and systems are very hard to change. And I think that's a pretty good theme for us to be carrying through this season in these times.
Jennifer, what's been your favorite piece of what's aired so far, and what are you most looking forward to audiences seeing in the back half of the season and into season 2?
I feel like the show really becomes even more interesting in the second half, thematically, and just the stakes for all of the characters. The first half, I think, is really fun, setting up the first half of the season, that is, setting up this sort of sci-fi, you know, sort of telling this very human story through this sci-fi lens, and being introduced to all of these different characters. I find, you know, the character of Ruth particularly delicious in those early episodes. But I love what happens in the second half of the season, just thematically, in terms of the kind of the conversations that are being had, the questions that I think Graeme is asking, and just the stakes for the individual characters. I know I really, as an actor, enjoyed those scenes very much.
And lastly, for Graeme, without giving too much away, what can you say about the remainder of this season and how it feeds into the second season?
Well, certainly at this point, halfway through the first season, we have set up David and Melanie in these opposing positions, and Melanie has betrayed him in a terrible fashion. The interesting thing that will unfold here is how these two characters come to see what they have in common. I think that at the end of the day and at the end of this season, David and Jennifer will have each gone through something where Jennifer's humanity has been opened up, or she's been forced to look at it, and that Leighton's own authoritarian tendencies and the difficulties of leadership, he's forced to confront that. So these two people from opposite ends of the train come together and clash, but when the future of humanity and future generations and kids is on the line, how close are they willing to be and work together, and what and who are they willing to sacrifice to survive?
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to TNT Snowpiercer, executive producer Graeme Manson, and stars Jennifer Connelly and David Diggs.
Thank you, Rick.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for taking the time.